Good day. Welcome to our global viewers and the C-SPAN audience to this very special contributor dialogue hosted by the Middle East Policy Council. My name is Basma Al-Gussein, and I am the Executive Director of the MEPC. The MEPC is a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan educational organization founded in 1981 and based in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to contribute to the American understanding of the political, economic, and cultural issues that affect the Middle East. You can learn more about us on our website at www.mepc.org. The contributor dialogues like this discussion today are designed to inform U.S. policymakers with the most current insight and analysis on urgent foreign policy matters in the Middle East. In this historic week in Afghanistan, we are so fortunate to have as our guest MEPC board member and former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, Ronald Neumann. Having lived in Afghanistan as a young man and as our U.S. ambassador there from 2005 to 2007, along with frequent visits at other points in the country's complex history, there are few experts today with the depth and nuance of understanding about the past, present, and future dynamics of Afghanistan. A huge welcome to Ambassador Neumann.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. To begin, I'd like to give our viewers a status update on where things stand today in Afghanistan. After a week of fast-moving events, to what extent are the Taliban fully in control of the country, and what is the status of evacuations being managed by the United States government?
Well, remember, I am not a spokesman for the United States government, and this is a fast-moving situation. The Taliban are in general control of Afghanistan, and they seem to be in full control of Kabul. There are still some places like the Panjshir Valley that say they are holding out in resistance and asking for more support, but generally most of the Afghan army has surrendered to the Taliban. In Kabul, you have an utter mess. We, the United States, I'm not in the government anymore, have brought in about 6,000 troops to help secure the airport. However, those troops are not going outside the airport. They are not bringing anybody in from Kabul city. The airport is absolutely mobbed with people. Right now, the last I heard an hour or so ago was that all gates in the airport are closed to entry. They're trying to get out people that are inside because they can't operate with all of them. There is an enormous pressure. You may have heard NPR this morning saying that some flights are leaving with half the seats empty because the people can't get to the airport. There's a huge crowd outside. It is not clear that it is necessarily Taliban preventing people from getting in. There's chaos, confusion, Taliban mess. What is clear is that there is no way you will get out. Even the people were already committed to getting out. We're committed to getting out the Americans. President Biden has said he will keep the troops at the airport until all the Americans are out. He has not said anything about whether he will keep troops out at the airport or the evacuation process going for all the interpreters and others on special immigrant visas.
Thank you, Ambassador. Recently, VP Amrullah Saleh is claiming to be a quote-unquote caretaker president as Ashraf Ghani had fled the country. What is the background to this position? Is there truth in the notion that he could potentially lead a meaningful resistance to the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan? I.e., is there any reason to hold on to hope?
Well, under the Constitution, Abdullah Saleh, as the first vice president, becomes acting president if President Ghani's out. President Ghani seems to have left, although the status is unclear because he's left the country, but I don't know that he's formally resigned. This is an issue that's going to be decided on the battlefield. There are people calling for American support for the remaining resistance forces. There are not many remaining resistance forces. I can't tell you from here whether there's any particular hope, but I would have to say it seems pretty unlikely that which could not be done with far more control of the country 2 weeks ago is going to get done now. In any event, I don't know what the chances are. I can say, as a matter of political judgment, it is unlikely that the Biden administration would move into some support for resistance at the same time that they are dependent on the Taliban to allow the evacuation to proceed in Kabul. That's just a question of political reality. Once that evacuation is over, I suppose they will get to making decisions about things like that.
Thank you, Ambassador. Given what you have seen so far since the Taliban took over governance in Afghanistan, which has included relatively moderate statements by the Taliban spokesman, how do you assess their likely approach towards governing and towards Afghan society, in particular the role and possible restrictions of women and girls?
It's much too early for anybody to have a valid answer to that very valid question. The Taliban are making softer noises. There are at the same time reports of mistreatment of people, of the Taliban going door to door, in some cases looking for former government supporters or maybe our interpreters and executing them. So this goes back to President Reagan's famous comment, trust but verify. I don't even know if I'd have much trust. One observes the comments, one hopes they are true, and one simply has to wait on performance. There's absolutely no basis on which to make a judgment now as to whether they mean what they say, or even whether the political group who are making the statements are fully in control of the militants who are in the streets.
Thank you. Given what you have seen over the past several months, is there truth to the notion that seems to have become conventional wisdom right now that the Afghan army, quote unquote, wouldn't fight? What is your perspective on the dynamics behind the rapid fall of the Afghan army?
I think that bumper sticker, which the administration is flailing around like a battle flag to try to divert responsibility, is a pretty gross misstatement. You know, it sounds as though we were doing the fighting, and then when we left, they wouldn't fight. Now, that's nonsense. For the last 3 years, the fighting has been carried on, actually for the last 20 years, by the Afghan army. Particularly in the last 3, after we drew our troops down, we had no casualties last year and less than 20 each of the 2 years before that. The Afghan army police, they had thousands of casualties. They have lost every year more in killed and wounded than we have lost in our entire time. Killed anyway, more than we've lost in our entire time in Afghanistan. What happened after we left actually began before we left. We began to create a doubt in the Afghan forces that they would be supported in the long term. This began really in the last American administration with the negotiation of the Doha Accords, which are not peace and which were not negotiated with any agreement of the Afghan government. We forced them to release 5,000 prisoners, many of whom have gone back to the battlefield. By the time President Biden made his decision, you had growing doubts about whether the American policy was real. Remember, President Biden said, we'll pull the troops out, but we will continue supporting Afghan forces. But he had no plan for that. I don't care what he says about planning. I know enough people to know there was no plan for how to maintain Afghan equipment, Afghan Air Force, deliver supplies, anything. So you had an increasing situation in which the Afghan military wondered if they fought, whether they would be supplied, whether casualties would be evacuated. Under those circumstances, people begin rethinking about what they're going to die for, and it was exacerbated by a very dysfunctional government in Kabul. Plenty of responsibility to go around for the Afghan government and its lack, but the basic problem was a problem of a collapse of morale, and the actions of America were heavily responsible, but not solely responsible for that collapse of morale.
Thank you for that. That's very disappointing to hear. Now, in light of the fact that the Taliban has taken control, do you see that the US and the international community might perhaps be able to utilize other tools, like, for example, different types of foreign aid and diplomatic recognition, in order to pressure, influence, or potentially moderate the Taliban's approach to Afghan society and governance?
Over a very long time, maybe. In the short term, not much. Uh, right now, the Taliban don't have a lot of reason to pay attention. We are going to have a very specific case very quickly, and that is whether we will continue to deliver aid money and particularly humanitarian supplies. A lot of Afghans are going to go food short. This country has a drought. We have now, because of the fall of the government, they no longer have access to a lot of international funding and to their bank accounts. And America and the international community are going to face a very stark question. Will they let people starve, or will they support or supply aid via the Taliban? If they supply aid via the Taliban, don't believe that you're going to have much control over what they do. If you don't, you will have Afghans starving. So the notion that we're going to stand back and we're going to be able to condition aid and they're going to pay a lot of attention, I think this is grossly exaggerated. And when it comes to the status of women, I think that conversation will eventually begin. I think the Taliban will have some interest, but how much interest, I don't know. So I think there may be a grounds to have a conversation, but expecting that you're going to preserve much, it's certainly not an expectation of Afghan women who are scared half to death. That is, educated women, people like yourself. They're the ones who are hiding, running to the airport, calling out desperately for somebody to help them to get them out of the country. So what I can tell you right now is this expectation of influence through aid is almost solely a foreign one. It is not one that you find echoed by Afghan women.
Thank you for sharing that. How concerned are you that the terrorist threat with global reach, will reemerge in Afghanistan under the Taliban rule? Do you think we will be able to adequately monitor such a potential development? And do you think the Taliban will welcome the presence of terrorist elements in Afghanistan, or rather, will they see it in their interest to prevent terrorist groups from reestablishing themselves in the country?
I do not believe we will be able to monitor it adequately. We had troubles monitoring it when we had 100,000 troops in country. We still found Al Qaeda cells that had sometimes been in place for months before we found them when we had all our assets. This is going to be, and we will not have the human intelligence that we had when we were in Afghanistan. Having betrayed them, their people are probably not going to work with us very much. The notion that we are going to control it from over the horizon, I think, is bogus. As one former commander of American Special Forces said to me, that you can pull off a one-time operation like a hostage rescue at long range. It's more difficult, it's more dangerous, but you can do it. And as he put it to me, you cannot have strategic effect that way. The agreement with the Taliban calls for them to control extreme forces, not to launch attacks. It does not actually call on them to even break ties with Al Qaeda. Both the UN and American intelligence reports over the last year have made clear that the Taliban has not broken their ties with Al Qaeda. And then I think you have to understand that our withdrawal decision is a huge victory for jihadi forces around the world, not just in Afghanistan. I mean, September 11 is now Taliban Victory Day. It is the day that proved Osama bin Laden was right when he said this was something that was in his computers that we found after he was killed. He said that he would draw the Americans into Afghanistan. They would not be able to sustain the battle and they would be defeated. So when you prove Osama bin Laden right, it suggests that God is on the side of the terrorists. you have just given them a huge propaganda victory. I don't know how that's going to play out. We've got a lot of other assets. We've found a lot of ways of dealing with this problem. But I believe that what General Milley, Chairman of Joint Chiefs, has said is that he expects the overall threat to build. That's certainly, I think, a CIA judgment. It is certainly my judgment. I don't know how. I have to see how it plays out. But the idea that we can turn our back on this is, I think, a pretty sorry judgment.
Thank you for that. As you are aware, there has been a lot of debate and disappointment among Democratic Party leadership themselves and this decision and how it played out. Specifically, Senator Bob Menendez, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, is committed to holding a series of oversight hearings on the decision and the implementation of the withdrawal, both stretching into the Biden and into the Trump administrations. In light of the controversy around recent events, do you think that somebody will have to resign? For example, there has been a lot of talk about current National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. If not him, what are some other potential ramifications that will happen within the Democratic Party?
Well, I am not going to touch Democratic Party politics with a 10-foot pole. But I think there's two or three things one could say. First of all, it's important to distinguish between the decision to withdraw and the execution of that decision. People will argue both sides of whether we should have gotten out, whether it was time to get out. The way we got out was a disaster, was a lamentable failure. The biggest piece of that failure was that we said we would continue to support the Afghan forces, and we had no plan in place to do that. In fact, I know people in the Defense Department, they were not informed in advance of what the decision would be. They were not instructed to plan, and they were given no time to plan. At no time in this process did we say before the decision that when we took out the troops, we would take out something like 15,000 contractors. The Afghan Air Force requires the contractors to maintain its self-flying. For that matter, the U.S. Air Force still uses a lot of contractors. The Afghan supply system needs contractors. Contractors were involved in overseeing a lot of other things. So when you suddenly pull the contractors, you gut the Afghan ability to fight. When we pulled out the way we did, when the Taliban had already were beginning to cut roads, we left many Afghan forces isolated. The Afghan Air Force was not big enough to fill the gap. It is performing actually quite heroically. And you can tell that the Taliban took it seriously because they were trying to assassinate pilots on the ground. But the fact is, there was no plan for how Afghan garrisons were going to be supplied when we pulled our air out. Now, if you want to hold somebody responsible, you'd have to start with the president, because, or whoever, it's the president's decision ultimately if you're going to keep this decision secret until you announce it, or if you're going to let your staff plan for how to execute the decision. Maybe you can pass the buck, but that I don't see the president resigning from a terrible decision. But Jake Sullivan looks like scapegoat.
On that point, sir, what is the potential logic or reasoning behind not providing DoD and Department of State with adequate time to prepare, in light of the fact that the U.S. had sole control?
You got the wrong guest on the program. You have to ask President Biden.
Okay.
I could see, the only logic I can imagine is they didn't want the decision to leak. And in our government, if you stand up a large planning process, it will leak. The other factor is they seem to have been terribly worried about increased casualties if the Taliban resumed targeting the Americans. that was the one aspect of the Doha Agreement that was being observed by the Taliban. They were not targeting American forces. I think that was hugely exaggerated, but they would have had to delay the withdrawal substantially beyond September to allow a planning period. Mm-hmm. And they clearly didn't want to do that. So you had a conflict between the time it would take to plan and the speed with which they wanted to leave. That may have also influenced the decision.
Thank you. Now, in light of current events, do you expect to see a large-scale exodus of refugees from Afghanistan? Since any such exodus would mainly affect Europe, how do you see the U.S. working with its European allies to prevent and/or address such a looming refugee crisis?
The odds are very good that you will have a large refugee crisis. You had up to 5 million Afghans that left the country during the years of fighting before we came in. By the way, one of the things, remember when people say how hopeless this all was at the start, which I think is false, is that you had massive happiness when we came into Afghanistan. You had nothing like the scenes of people trying to get away. In the end, you had a return flow of 2 or 3 million immigrants, Afghans. Now, I think you're going to have that problem again, but the Taliban are sealing things up. People are not able to get out. There's no equivalent to boat people. There's no coast. So whatever unfolds may happen somewhat slowly. I do think there is a huge American moral responsibility for a much larger refugee program that we ought to be engaged in, but that's a separate issue from your question.
Can you speak a little bit to the special immigrant visa program, the backlog at the State Department, and why things are such a mess?
Yeah, a great deal of the backlog. Can you clip? I don't know. Sorry. Hope you can edit that out. First of all, a lot of the backlog is not at the State Department. The backlog is in the clearance process in Washington, because the way the SIV process works, it's terribly cumbersome. People had to produce all kinds of documents. And then if they were accepted initially at the embassy, and that was a fairly rigid process defined by law, then their file went back to Washington, and then they waited a year, 2 years, 3 years for word to come that they were cleared and they could proceed to Kabul for an exit interview, for an immigration interview. So there was a backlog that built up. The process was horribly run in Washington, was horribly run under the Trump administration, and it did not get any better under the Biden administration. That left you with this big backlog of people. As we began to approach this decision to pull out, there was increasing congressional pressure and popular pressure to move the program. And there's a report out today that you may have seen in the newspaper. I can't validate it, but it says that there was a cable, what's called a dissent channel cable, from some of the staff in Embassy Kabul back in the middle of July, saying they needed to begin an evacuation program, but we did not begin any such program. If we had, and we are still in this problem of, we're only bringing back into the US the people that have completed this cumbersome clearance process. But then you've got, 15, 17,000 people that have applied, but they haven't been fully cleared. And of course, let's say there's 15,000, the average Afghan family is probably 5 at least. So, you're up at 75, you rough, guesstimate of math, you're up at 75,000 people at that point. With no commitment to bring them into the United States, we're bringing them into Kuwait and Qatar. I don't know how we're going to get them out or process them there, or how fast. So this program is a god-awful mess, and it could have been much smoother if once they'd made the withdrawal decision, they had started at least an evacuation of the SIVs there who had not been processed fully, then you could have probably almost totally removed this backlog. But that is a political failure of President Biden and his national security staff who did not authorize any such process. It's not a State Department problem.
Thank you, Ambassador. Looking at this from 35,000 feet, there is further quote unquote conventional wisdom that this mission was always impossible. Do you agree or disagree with that? And what is there to learn from this 20-year US presence in Afghanistan?
Well, that's at least a seminar, and we'll be at this for a long time, you know. I don't agree that it was impossible. I agree it was always hard. I don't think it was necessarily impossible. And people will argue about this. I mean, this is not going to be something that people are going to prove conclusively, but I think there's certain things you could look at. First of all, just how happy people were when we first came in. And we made a lot of mistakes along the way, and the Afghan authorities made a lot of mistakes, and we could have a whole nother conversation about that, probably several. But I think one thing that's important to understand is how one defines what we were trying to do, what the American government was trying to do. There was never a decision to try to build a wonderful functioning democracy. That was a byproduct of a different kind of decision. The question from the beginning was, once you kicked out the Taliban, this was before my arrival time in Kabul, I came in 2005. The question in 2002 was, you kicked out the Taliban. Now, how do you just go away and leave the country in total chaos? You know, you broke it, but now you don't want to have any responsibility for it? Or do you do something? Then the question becomes, how do you put in place a stable, even modestly stable situation that you can leave? And that was where you had these discussions in Bonn that were led by the UN, with the US playing a big role, and it set up a transitional government, and it set up this whole process of elections. And I think there's a lot of criticism you can make of that process. But in a way, that criticism is kind of cheap unless you have an idea of what it is you want to do in all its place. You know, if you don't like that, is your view that we should not have gone into Afghanistan? That's an argument. People feel we had to go in because of the Taliban giving refuge to Al-Qaeda that had just killed 3,000 Americans in New York. If you go in and boot the Taliban out, do you then say, well, Afghans could just go ahead and die in misery. We've satisfied our vengeance. We're out of here. I don't know that Americans would have been very comfortable with that situation. Well, then you try to build something. Then when you get to President Obama, who felt the mission had gotten too expanded, he was probably right. And Obama said, we're not going to do nation building. And we were explicitly by policy not doing nation building under President Obama, but there's a little flaw in this problem. And that is that in order to walk away with a rebel insurgency that was expanding with the Taliban, you needed an army. You needed to build the army. In order to build the army, armies don't exist free floating in space. They're part of a state. So if you're going to have an army, you have to have a state. And if you're going to have a state, you got to have some kind of economy. And so there's a logic of what you're trying to achieve requires, in fact, reinforcing a state. And you can hate that logic. President Obama certainly hated it, but he didn't get away from it. He just denied we were doing it, didn't want to do it, and then had a $2 billion aid program that only makes sense if you're doing state building. So it was very difficult, but I would say short answer is I don't think it was impossible. I think we wasted a lot of time when we had the best opportunity in the early years when there was no fighting. I mean, I could drive around large parts of Afghanistan even in 2005. It became progressively more difficult, but it also became progressively more difficult to figure out how to leave. And I'm not defending the administrations that came after, or even during my time, but I think that gives you a little more sense of what the real questions were.
Thank you so much for your invaluable insights. It was such an honor to have Ambassador Ron Neumann, who is a member of the Middle East Policy Council Board, join us today. At the end of this, you will be able to access our entire conversation on the MEPC YouTube channel. Please subscribe, and also through our website, www.mepc.org. I'd also like to take a moment to remind you to subscribe to our journal, The Middle East Policy, which is the most widely cited journal on Middle Eastern affairs in the entire world. We appreciate you all taking the time to discuss these important issues with us today, and we look forward to continuing conversations on pressing issues to U.S. Mideast relations. Have a wonderful day.